Hello, everyone. Bonjour à tous et à tous. Welcome to our webinar session on what we heard, consultations on bulk purchasing and the essential prescription drugs and related product list. Before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge that Canada's Drug Agency will recognize the traditional territories, rights, and diversity of all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities across Canada. We acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have been and continue to be excluded from and harmed by Canada's healthcare systems. In the spirit of reconciliation, we are committed to addressing these inequities alongside Indigenous communities. I'm joining you from Toronto today. Since time immemorial, this has been the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now the home to many diverse First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I'm Dan Singh, Director of Strategy and Innovation at Canada's Drug Agency, and I have the pleasure of introducing our panel today and moderating this session. From left to right on your screen, Dr. Alexandra King, Co-Chair, Essential Prescription Drugs and Related Products Advisory Panel, is an international medicine specialist with a focus on HIV/AIDS and hepatitis C. She's also a member of the Nipissing First Nation in Ontario and the Cameco Chair in Indigenous Health and Wellness at the University of Saskatchewan. Alan Lefrère, the other co-chair, Essential Prescription Drugs and Related Products Advisory Panel, has extensive management and volunteer leadership experience in the not-for-profit sector and healthcare. His involvement began through his son's cancer care and led to roles such as vice chair of the National Blood Safety Council and public member on the Canadian Drug Expert Committee. He continues to serve on several advisory committees representing their patient perspectives. Diane MacArthur, Chair, National Bulk Purchasing Strategy Advisory Panel, is a retired Ontario public servant, currently a member of the Board of Directors of the Ontario Financing Authority and at Belmont House, a charitable nonprofit home for older adults offering long-term care and retirement living. She also chairs the Procedural Review Panel for Canada's Drug Agency and was a member of the Pan-Canadian Advisory Panel on a framework for a prescription drug list. And finally, Brent Fraser, Vice President, Pharmaceuticals at Canada's Drug Agency. So today's webinar will be delivered in two parts. Part one will provide an overview of the essential prescription drugs and related products work of the advisory panel. Then we'll spend most of our time discussing how the advisory panel engaged with different individuals who participated in these engagement opportunities and highlight some of the input we received, as well as how that input informed the advisory panel's discussions. Then we'll move to part two on the bulk purchasing strategy. Similarly, starting with an overview, a summary of the approach, and then share the feedback received and how the input informed that advisory panel's advice. We'll save time at the end of both presentations for Q&A. You don't have to wait until the end to ask your question, so please feel free to enter at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And just to note that today's session is being recorded and will be made publicly available. A little bit more context before we dive in. Among a range of activities, the Pharmacare Act mandates Canada's Drug Agency to prepare a list of essential prescription drugs and related products to inform the potential development of a national formulary, provide advice on ways to build upon currently available structures and processes to strengthen Canada's collective bulk purchasing power for prescription drugs and related products on a national formulary. Under the Act, the Minister is also required to establish a committee of experts to make recommendations regarding options for the operation and financing of national universal single-payer pharmacare. The work in that box on the right is out of scope for us, so our session will focus on the first two panels, which Canada's Drug Agency has been directed to undertake under this legislation. The information about these two panels is available on our website. And now I'll pass the overview of our work on the essential prescription drugs and related products list over to Alan.
Thanks, Dan. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, I guess, depending what time zone you're in. I'm pleased to join you today from Regina, so I'm in Treaty 4 territory. So we'll get started today by just sharing a bit of a summary of the background of our work and the context for the work we undertook. Next slide. As Dan noted, under the Pharmacare Act, Canada's Drug Agency was asked to prepare a proposed list of essential prescription drugs and related products. To support this work, CDA convened our panel, which I had the pleasure of co-chairing along with Dr. Alexandra King, as Dan introduced us. Our panel leveraged two previous bodies of work related to national pharmacare, namely the 2019 report from the Advisory Council on the Implementation of National Pharmacare, a committee or a process, I guess, that was led by Dr. Eric Hoskins. And then the 2022 work, which was the first iteration of this panel, the Pan-Canadian Advisory Panel on a Framework for Prescription Drug List. And that was a panel that Dr. King and I also had the pleasure of chairing. The guiding principles and framework, framework criteria that were set out by that 22 panel served as the foundation for us in our current deliberations and recommendations relating to the proposed list. The framework embeds equity at its core and considers the needs of subpopulations, for example, like pediatric patients, with the aim of improving health equity and overall outcomes in the healthcare system in Canada. Next slide. We're a time-limited advisory panel, and our time as a committee is coming to a close next month. We consisted 12 members from across the country and brought together a fairly wide range of experience and expertise, including healthcare providers from various disciplines, people lived and living with cancer, people lived and living experience as patients, sorry, not just oncology patients, but all patients, people of First Nations or Métis background, people working with Indigenous and other communities often made vulnerable through socioeconomic policies and structural barriers, and individuals with backgrounds in health administration. And to supplement the panel's expertise, we also invited clinical experts to provide input and recommendations on key therapeutic areas, and particularly in the area of oncology and respiratory systems. Of course, managing conflicts of interest amongst a group like this is an important component of our process. Every panel member was fully transparent with their declarations prior to any and all discussions. And if you're interested, those conflict of interest declarations and short biographies of each member are publicly available on CDA's website. I have to say this is a very engaged and diverse group. The tasks we had at hand were quite complex, and at times the discussions were very challenging. Divergent opinions were openly embraced, and I think the results of the work we did demonstrate that. Next slide. Yep. So this slide speaks to the mandate that was given to us. We were asked to prepare a list of essential prescription drugs and related products to inform the development of a national formulary. And so essential drugs that were commonly prescribed really is what our goal was. And I think Alexandra will talk a little more about some of the challenges we faced with that, some of that wording. So we were directed to start with the clean meds list, include a range of recommended drugs and related products for each of the therapeutic classes, and to be aligned with the lists of covered contraceptives and treatments for diabetes that were already included in the Pharmacare Act. Furthermore, any additions or modifications to the list should include drugs and related products that are commonly prescribed in Canada, wording that we struggled with in terms of what that really means, with an emphasis on those that have been proven to be safe, effective, and of good value. We were also going to include guidance from clinicians and patients with reference to clinical practice guidelines that are used in Canada where they were appropriate. And the list should be informed by the WHO, the World Health Organization Model of Essential Medicines, or WHO EML, wherever that was appropriate. So in addition to preparing this list, we were also asked to establish a methodology that would include an assessment and selection criteria to guide future updates so that the list could be consistent, so the approach to the list could consistently be applied over time. So for those of you who aren't familiar with clean meds, it was short term for the clinical, short name for a clinical trial called Carefully Selected and Easily Accessible at No Charge Medications. Quite a mouthful, but a trial undertaken by Dr. Nav Prasad and his team between 2016 and 2020. So now I'll hand this back over to Alexandra to continue with our approach on the list.
Thanks, Alan. Hi, everybody. And like Alan, I'm quite delighted to be here and really enjoyed this work and getting to work with Alan as well as the CDA team. So with the background in mind that has been presented in the next few slides, we will share our approach to generating the initial list, the criteria that were used and how we applied them, the results of that initial list prior to the consultation, and our recommendation on maintaining the list over time. Next slide, please. So following the scope of what was asked of us, we considered the clean meds as a starting point, which has 128 drugs. It is important to note that we looked at all 14 designated therapeutic categories, including products for diabetes and contraception. The key point here is that we did not revisit the specific products that were already selected by the Government of Canada, for example, insulin, because they were already considered to be included. In this case, there were 8 of the 128 that were already selected by the Government of Canada, either for diabetes or contraception. We also examined the WHO EML 2023 list at a point in time. So 236 drugs were put forward for consideration. Certain categories in the WHO EML were considered out of scope for one of the following reasons. First of all, not for community use. So for example, anesthetics, preoperative medicines, medical gases. Also, they were funded by a non-drug public program. So for example, vaccines covered by public health. Medicines that were also excluded for one of the following reasons were: 1, medicines not available in Canada were removed from the list. 2, if the agent had no DIN. 3, agents used solely inpatient hospitals. So these would be things that were not used in community settings, including infusion or outpatient clinics. Or for the indication not applicable to Canada. So for example, Ebola. So while the clean meds and WHO EML were helpful starting points in developing a list of products to inform the potential development of a national formulary in Canada, the advisory panel felt that there were gaps in meeting the diverse needs of people in Canada. To address any potential gaps, the advisory panel formulated a strategy and process to ensure the proposed list was relevant to the Canadian context. This will be discussed in an upcoming slide. The panel recommended 218 additional products to be considered. The total drug products put forward for this initial list was 655 drugs, along with 9 related products. We also want to highlight that in addition to the list of products, information was provided for each drug or related product as applicable. Listing status on identified 13 public drug plan formularies, HTA recommendation from CDA-AMC or l'Institut National d'Excellence en Santé et en Services Sociaux, or INES. And this is if the recommendation from CDA-AMC was not available. We also looked at utilization data, both public and private claims, as well as claimants by age and sex, if available. Availability of generic or biosimilar products. Indication of potential considerations in specific subpopulations, such as Indigenous peoples, pediatric, underserved, and or underrepresented populations, and other references, including the critical and vulnerable drug list and clinical practice clinical guidance documents as references for the deliberation. Next slide, please. Because related products are not defined in the Pharmacare Act, the advisory panel followed the working definition of related products from the work that was previously developed and applied by the 2022 Pan-Canadian Advisory Panel on a framework for a prescription drug list. Specifically, a related product is a, quote, device that directly supports the delivery, administration, and optimal use of products to assist in the safe use of a drug or our dose management tools to improve patient care, end quote. So for example, spacers for salbutamol. Next slide, please. Before we go any further, We want to make it clear that our use of the term include or exclude does not infer that a product should be interpreted beyond the context of what has been asked of this advisory panel, which is to simply prepare the proposed list of essential prescription drugs and related products, and to consider which products could be included in such a list as outlined under the Pharmacare Act. It should not be extrapolated as recommendations for the current drug review and approval process, or provide any signal for current public or private drug plans about their decisions to include or exclude a product under their respective formularies. With this in mind, the slide simply provides the assessment criteria that the panel used to consider which products should be included. Drugs that are provided in the initial list, for example, Clean Meds List, WHO, EML, CIHI's Top 100 list, top 3 in its class, or net new class recommended by experts, would be considered for inclusion if they met the process requirements. For example, a positive HTA, or health technology assessment, including publicly funded by 7 or more drug plans or cancer agencies. If a product is publicly included by fewer than 7 drug plans or cancer agencies, the following factors may be considered. The product addresses equitable access. So, for example, used by different age groups, including pediatric patients, remove barriers to access in rural or remote communities or in Indigenous communities. Also, consideration given to the impact of the drug, if included, on system-wide resources. And then finally, other available information to support the deliberation. For example, utilization data, biosimilar or generic product available. If a drug was identified as a new drug class, so again, not on Clean Meds and or WHO EML, it must be recommended as first-line treatment by a Canadian HTA recommendation. And where an HTA recommendation is not available, it must be recommended as first-line treatment in a clinical practice guideline used in Canada and meets all the process requirements. For example, listing status. First-line treatments are the most common and preferred drugs prescribed as initial therapy for most patients, and therefore met the advisory panel's definition of commonly prescribed and aligned with the scope of this task. Combination products would be included if each component of the combination was also included on the proposed list. So, for example, perindopril and amlodipine. Each as a single agent were included, and therefore the combination would also be included on our proposed list. For related products, a device that directly supports the delivery, administration, and optimal use of drugs to assist in the safe use of a drug, or dose management tool, and is funded by 1 or more public programs would be considered for inclusion. So again, space refers salbutamol, since this drug is recommended for inclusion. Next slide, please. On this slide, you can see the assessment criteria that was proposed by the advisory panel for exclusion. And essentially, it's those not available in Canada, not listed in any identified public plan or cancer agency formulary at the time of the assessment, if it had received a negative HTA recommendation for clinical reasons, if it was considered out of scope because it is not usually funded by public drug plans and may be available through other funding mechanisms, if it is not commonly prescribed in the community because it is usually an inpatient treatment or has low utilization, if it belongs to a new drug class and is not recommended as a first-line treatment, either by HTA or clinical practice references, and if it does not meet pre-specified criteria and process. Next slide, please. So this rather complicated diagram basically is what we ended up deriving as a transparent set of standard set of criteria and process to determine which products are eligible for inclusion on the proposed list. And it was an important factor to ensure procedural fairness and legitimacy of process. As noted earlier, the panel determined it was important to consider drugs beyond those listed on the Clean Meds or WHO EML and implemented the following approach to ensure the proposed list addressed gaps relevant to the Canadian context. Each of the additional drugs that were recommended by the panel, including those recommended from the consultation, were all put through this process algorithm. So on the one side, you will see the essential drugs pathway, and it evaluates the following: whether the drug is included in the Canadian Institute for Health Information Top 100. It would go through the path to determine the HTA and public funding status. Alternatively, if the drug belongs to a drug class that is part of the Clean Meds or WHO EML, such as statins, high utilization data is used to determine if the drug is one of the top 3 prescribed drugs in its class. And if it is not within the top 3, the drug is excluded and removed from the process. The outcome of the HTA in Canada, and we should note that a do not reimburse recommendation for clinical reasons led to the drugs being excluded and removed from the process. And then whether or not the drug is publicly funded by 7 or more plans or cancer agencies. On the other side, what you have is the commonly prescribed drug pathway, which evaluated the following. For drugs that belong to a class not included in Clean Meds or WHO EML, the first step is to determine the outcome of the HTA in Canada. If the recommendation is do not reimburse for clinical reasons, the drug is excluded and removed from the process. The next step is to determine if the drug is recommended as a first-line treatment in the HTA recommendation. If the HTA in Canada is unavailable, the drug must be referenced as a first-line treatment in a clinical practice guideline used in Canada. If it is not a first-line treatment, then the drug is excluded and removed from the process. The final step is to determine if the drug was publicly funded by 7 or more plans or cancer agencies. If yes, then the drug was included and considered commonly prescribed. In both cases, drugs funded by less than 7 plans must meet 1 or more of the factors outlined in the previous slide, or they were excluded. Notably, the advisory panel was highly cognizant of the importance of considering health equity and other guiding principles to ensure that each product is reviewed with these lenses in mind. Next slide, please. So initial results prior to consultation, of the 655 drugs, 513 were included and 142 were excluded. Of the 9 related products, 6 were included and 3 were excluded. Next slide. Maintaining the proposed list is essential to ensuring that drugs and related products are used in a safe, appropriate, and cost-effective manner. As evidence evolves and new therapies become available, it will be important to review these new therapies while assessing whether the drugs included in the proposed list continue to offer value. While recognizing the resource-intensive nature of updating the proposed list and conducting reassessments, the advisory panel noted that the process must be efficient, timely, and able to meet the quality standards, as there may be new evidence available for products that could substantially change treatment pathways. Of note, the advisory panel supported the proposed list 1, undergo regular re-evaluation to ensure that it continues to be informed by up-to-date evidence and is sustainable, effective, and of high quality. This could be made every 2 years, which would align with the timing for revisions and updates to the WHO EML. 2, consider high-impact products as they emerge outside of the regular update cycle. 3, utilize formulary management best practices, for example, therapeutic reviews, prescribing guidance resources, and proactive strategies to manage the impact of drug shortages. And then 4, reflects the need of all interested parties with a process that integrates perspectives of patients, clinicians, and health system partners. I will hand it back to Alan to share our engagement approach.
Thanks, Alexandra. So, of course, reaching out to the community broadly, I think, and consulting and getting some feedback on this was an important part of our work. So, in our next few slides, we'll talk about how we approach that. Next slide. So we consulted as widely as possible with the support of CDA and worked diligently to ensure that a comprehensive foundation of knowledge and perspectives are incorporated in the final report. The consultation period was held between June 19th and July 18th of this year. It's worth noting that the federal election in April delayed our consultation process and pushed it into the summer, which isn't a great time to try and reach people, and we recognize that. However, the timeline for completion of our work was in our mandate, and it meant we couldn't stretch the consultation process any further. I certainly personally would have liked to have seen us do more and do longer, but despite those limitations, I was nonetheless still quite impressed by the breadth, depth, and thoughtfulness of the feedback that we received. So we asked 4 key questions as part of this. You're only seeing 3 on your screen, but so the first was, do you have a suggestion that could enhance the process that we proposed? And we had provided a draft document that people were able to look at. Second question, do you have specific suggestions to support the process for updating the proposed list over time? Third question, can you identify potential additional commonly prescribed drugs in Canada that were not already assessed by the panel? And if that was yes, then could you also provide specific examples and supporting information that would help us evaluate it? The fourth question, the one that's not shown on the slide, was an open-ended question, basically asking if people had any other comments that they'd like to share with us about the information presented in the discussion paper. Next slide. So there were 2 parts to this engagement process: an online response form that was available to anybody to fill in, and a series of focus groups that were conducted. The online submission process was fully open to the public. We received 84 responses reflecting quite a wide range of perspectives. The focused engagement sessions, the focus groups, were done to ensure the perspective of populations made vulnerable were included, particularly Indigenous peoples and those who've experienced the historic and ongoing impacts of colonization. So there were 3 focused engagement activities with 10 participants who either identified as First Nations, Inuit, or Métis, or they were people who work in those communities. And there were also 2 focused engagements, which included 7 healthcare providers and others who represent or work with the underrepresented and underserved groups. And I'll provide a little more detail on that later. The asterisk beside number 17 indicates there were additional briefings and/or consultations that were held with internal CDA committees or external groups, but those numbers are not counted in these totals. On a broader note, CDA is deeply committed to fostering meaningful, respectful, and inclusive engagement with everyone who's impacted by their work, and any further feedback and dialogue regarding the evolution of those engagement practices is welcome at any time. Importantly, we will be posting on the CDA website the summaries of the focused engagements and the full submissions provided to us online, so you're welcome to look at those once we get everything up. Next slide. So this summarizes who we heard from. So the highest number of the submissions were from patients and patient representatives, followed by healthcare providers. Combined, they accounted for 56% of the submissions. Commercial groups, industry, and associations were 27%, and other groups, including government, regional health authorities, researchers, labor unions, and consultants, were that 4th category. You'll note that the numbers don't quite add up because some of the patient submissions were submitted on behalf of multiple groups, and so the percentages take that into consideration. I'll turn it back to Alexandra at this point.
Great, thanks. So in the next few slides, we will highlight some of the key themes that we heard from the online submissions. We really want to acknowledge that we read every submission that came in, but given the time constraints that we have for this information session, we are summarizing the major themes. However, we have considered all the comments that were received. Next slide, please. So the first question related to suggestions on how the process for preparing the list could be enhanced. Many respondents provided helpful suggestions. The panel revisited the different sections to ensure that clarity was provided throughout the report. For example, clarifying how the drug list was generated and detailing information about the 14 main anatomical groups within the anatomical therapeutic chemical or ATC classification system. This classification system groups active medical substances or active ingredients according to the organ or system on which they act and based on their therapeutic, pharmacological, or chemical properties. Additionally, the panel took on an objective assessment of the criteria to determine if a drug or related product should be included or excluded from the proposed list. Much of this discussion revolved around health equity and the accompanying guiding principles. For example, deliberations that took into account the needs of Indigenous communities, pediatric patients, underserved or underrepresented populations, and discussions about unique benefits or risks of a product to these populations to inform the inclusion of the proposed list. The panel also acknowledged the importance of enhancing the transparency of the process. We heard from many respondents on opportunities for broad engagement in the process. The panel agrees and is deeply committed to fostering meaningful, respectful, and inclusive engagement with all those impacted by this work, especially patients, clinicians, Indigenous partners, and underserved or underrepresented communities. Reflecting feedback from a wide range of perspectives offers a rich and comprehensive foundation to this work and this very important topic. Next slide, please. In terms of the proposed process for including and excluding products, you can see what is listed here. Essentially, conflicts of interest, the need for transparency, and also the future work. And so we considered each one of these. Next slide, please. The second question related on how the list could be maintained over time. Similar themes were drawn from feedback relating to the approach and transparency of process and engaging with interested parties. And so again, on this slide, you can see the methodology and transparency and the panel's considerations. Next slide, please. And so this slide here is summing up the themes that we heard for the proposed process for updating the list. And I think, you know, some of the things that are important are the need for broad engagement with interested parties in the process for updating the list, and also opportunities to partner with organizations to embed supply chain resiliency in the assessment and reassessment, as well as consider evidence-based frameworks, particularly as we move forward in time. So Alan will now share highlights from our focused engagement session.
So as I mentioned earlier, one part of our engagement involved focused discussions with 10 First Nations, Métis, and non-Indigenous physicians and pharmacists from across Canada. These folks were identified by CDA by reaching out through their existing extensive networks. And these are, as Alexandra mentioned, these are highlights, not a complete summary, but there will be a summary posted on the website. Overall, their feedback was positive regarding the work our panel had undertaken so far, and they felt that the recommended medications seemed to be appropriate given the northern and remote contexts of many of their patients. However, they did identify gaps related to the treatment of H. pylori, PTSD, and certain nutrient supplements, all of which we subsequently reviewed as a group. They also raised concerns about the higher prevalence of autoimmune disease, tuberculosis, and STIs in Indigenous populations, as well as the issues of the distinct needs of the Métis communities who do not have NIHB coverage, and supply chain and substitution challenges faced in northern and remote communities. Next slide. They also called for greater transparency in inclusion and exclusion decisions, a theme that I think you also heard the slides that Alexandra just mentioned. They also were eager to see more active involvement of Indigenous clinicians and a more agile review process that could respond quickly to emerging needs. Again, consistent with some of the things we heard in the online submissions. They did express a consensus that a 2-year update cycle is insufficient, with preference for permanent standing committee and options for ad hoc reviews. And they emphasized that the list development should be iterative, collaborative process rather than a one-time exercise on a fixed 2-year cycle, integrating Indigenous perspectives into decision-making, ensuring transparent communication, and ensuring that the list is responsive to the realities of Indigenous communities will be essential for its ongoing relevance and effectiveness. Next slide. So now we'll move on to the 2 focus groups from the underrepresented and underserved populations. So there were 7 participants here, and they offered insights from their experience working with groups such as children, immigrants and refugees, unhoused people, migrant workers, 2S LGBTQ+ people, as well as folks accessing reproductive and sexual health services, people experiencing poverty, and people without access to a primary care provider. Again, we heard about the need to communicate and the overall process for including and excluding products. That's pretty consistent across everything we've heard through all of the consultation, I think, especially to avoid confusion or misinformation amongst the public. The selection process for drugs and related products should be explicitly incorporate principles of health equity, ensuring that underserved and underrepresented populations are not disproportionately affected by the inclusion or exclusion of products. I think for me, the word disproportionate here was really important. I didn't hear them asking for special treatment. I heard a call to not be disproportionately affected by any decisions, likely made through a lack of understanding of their unique situations. Next slide. Again, we heard concerns about the interval for major updates and the need for interim process for considering essential medicines and products, particularly for populations whose needs may not be captured using existing criteria. They expressed concern that ongoing evaluation considers real use and real experience, not just clinical trial data. And the definition of high impact should account for the needs of underserved and underrepresented populations, even if the number of people is small, to avoid disadvantaging these groups. Involving clinicians from a wide range of practice settings to help ensure this list reflects real world needs and doesn't overlook those underserved by the healthcare system. And they shared a number of specific circumstances relating to the proposed drugs and related products list as they relate to the various underrepresented and underserved populations. Back to you, Alexandra.
Thanks, Alan. Okay, so we recognize the following topics were out of scope of this panel's work, but we would like to take time to acknowledge the effort and time that all respondents have put in and to share these comments that could be informative for future considerations. Next slide, please. So we simply want to highlight the emerging themes that we heard from the respondents on activities that are beyond the scope of our work, but are important considerations. So first of all, expanding the scope to new product categories. Future iterations could consider products currently out of scope of the list. For example, specialized nutritional products or formulas and other therapeutic products. For example, compounded products not initially included might be evaluated for inclusion if they become essential to patient care. Setting a framework to assess such categories would ensure that the list remains comprehensive and relevant to healthcare needs. Next, embedding a planetary health lens. There is an opportunity to partner with relevant organizations to integrate best practices on reducing the impact of medications on the environment. We heard about preferences to lower carbon intensive drugs, and where appropriate, would be an important factor to consider for any future assessment or reassessment process. Next, developing accessible communication about the legislative mandate. We heard about the importance of plain language communication about the intent of the legislation and how this may work in principle. Next, integrating supply chain resiliency. Respondents also shared examples of opportunities to partner with relevant organizations and experts to embed supply chain resiliency into the formulary assessment and reassessment process. This means that when updating the list, considerations of drug availability and strategies to prevent or mitigate shortages, especially for critical medicines, are incorporated. By planning for supply risk, for instance, through close monitoring of the critical and vulnerable drug list, the updated list can be made more robust against disruptions, thus better serving patients. Adopting advanced evaluation frameworks. To enhance how drugs are assessed for inclusion or continuation on the list, respondents suggested the use of evidence-based evaluation frameworks could be expanded. For example, incorporating such outcomes-focused measures could complement traditional clinical and economic evidence, ensuring that the list prioritizes medication that truly makes a difference in patient outcomes. Last, establishing monitoring and evaluation of the list's impact. We also heard that it would be important to develop systematic evaluation and monitoring process for the list of products. For instance, this could involve defining metrics and collecting data on how the formulary is utilized and its effect on health outcomes and system performance. Regular monitoring could address questions such as, are drugs on the list being prescribed appropriately? Is the list improving medication access and health equity? Such an evaluation framework would include continuous quality improvement in the formulary process and demonstrate its value to interested parties. Well beyond the scope of this work, we wanted to take time to highlight these comments for awareness and consideration in future work. So I'm now going to hand it back to Alan.
Thanks, Alexandra. Got to get my mute off here. So we very much appreciate the effort of all the respondents who put in the effort to identify products for consideration on the proposed list, including providing additional information and references, which was important for us to be able to track down and do some of the research on these. So what did we hear? The next slide, please. So this is what we heard about specific drugs through all of the various different engagements. We received feedback on 235 drugs and 4 related products for consideration for a total of 239. 126 of those were new products and were put forward for assessment by the panel, working through that the rubric, the rather complex flowchart that Alexander had talked about. 113 of the 239 were duplicates, either already in our included or excluded list, or were referenced by the already included in the Government of Canada's list for diabetes and contraception. Of these duplicates, 7 were revisited by the panel because additional information was provided by the respondents. Next slide. Based on the product submissions received, the top 3 therapeutic areas were the antineoplastic immunomodulating category, followed by alimentary tract and metabolism, and respiratory. The top 3 drugs requested for reconsideration or consideration were tinzaparin, the combination of sacubitril and valsartan, and insulin. So this little chart explains where we ended up. So after the consultation, I don't know if you can remember back to the slide that Alexandra spoke to, but in total we started initially with 664 products, 655 drugs, and 9 related products. So that 664 is now grown to a total of 790. We started with 513 drugs to be included. We're now at 537 on our list. And 142 that we were suggesting should be excluded, and that number is now up to 240. In the related products category, we started at 6, we remain at 6, whereas the excluded, there were 4 that were added to our list, and we looked at them and none of them were included. So this concludes our discussion about our part of the panel. I'm going to pass this back to Dan to introduce the next portion for us.
Thanks very much, Alan and Alexandra. We're moving on to part 2 now, and I'll pass it to Brent to get us started.
Hey, thanks, Dan. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about the work that we did related to the bulk purchasing strategy. We can jump to the next slide. think we can skip over this as Dan's provided this information earlier. So I wanted to provide a general overview of the work that was done prior to the advisory panel being established and them deliberating on the information that they had in front of them. This work all started back in April of 2024. The initial piece of work that was done is really to understand what's happening in Canada with respect to procurement and the various individuals that are involved or sectors that are involved in the distribution channel, bringing it from the manufacturer through to the ultimate consumer, which is the patient who receives the drug. So an environmental scan was undertaken by Morse Consulting. It was a very extensive report, and it ultimately resulted in an overview of the system that is included in the consultation document. If you still have it on page 7, we know of it as calling it often Figure 1. After the scan was submitted through to CDA for review, we hosted a roundtable session in November of last year to have participants look at the report and identify whether or not there is any information that was either incorrect or missing from the material. And from that, we would look at whether there was additional findings that needed to be considered as part of the core work. So the core work, which we're going to be talking about today, is really the work of the advisory panel. And they were looking at opportunities that could optimize the current system, taking into consideration the impact of a bulk purchasing strategy on different aspects across the healthcare system within Canada. In addition to that, once that work was in its final stages, we did host a similar type of consultation as the EML group did to solicit feedback from individuals, and Diane will go over that in more detail later in this presentation. Ultimately leading to the final advice, which would be submitted at the same time as the EML work to the federal government that provides advice on strengthening Canada's collective purchasing power to inform a future bulk purchasing approach for a national formulary. The next slide. So what was in scope was basically all prescription medications within Canada that are available in the community setting. This could potentially include over-the-counter products. We didn't think that there would be a difference in the approach, whether it was prescription or OTCs. We didn't specifically focus on OTCs within the report. In addition, we also looked at devices and other related products. We used the same definition as the EML group did for related products, just to ensure consistency across both reports. We looked at opportunities for pricing and purchasing, different types of factors that could be considered for either of those two buckets, as well as looking at advice that builds on our current approaches as opposed to a long-term view at this point in time. And then we also looked at how could that bulk purchasing advice impact some of the stakeholders and affected parties. What was not in scope were elements of the supply chain that is really beyond purchasing. So contract things like payment terms and arrangements, the storage and logistics of the product, how it's physically delivered from one group to another. And we also did not develop a detailed plan or playbook for the strategy. This is really focusing on advice that as this work progresses, these are the key areas that we think are opportunities for people to look at in developing the final strategy for bulk purchasing. Any aspects beyond the Pharmacare Act or any aspects of the Pharmacare Act that were beyond bulk purchasing was also out of scope for this group. Next slide. So some of the key takeaways from the roundtable in particular is that product movement for related products doesn't really change compared to prescription products. So we essentially just talked about them as a group, as opposed to distinguishing between prescription products, non-prescription, and then related products as well. There was a number of themes that came out of the discussion from the table. We had 28 individuals who participated in the roundtable. It was a facilitated discussion. And that represented 19 different perspectives. So that included folks from the pharma sector, group purchasing organizations, patient advisors, academia, private payers, and we also had a presentation from individuals in Norway to talk about their purchasing approach as well. Some of the key themes, first one is don't complicate the system. It's already complicated enough as it is, that they don't want any of the advice to add additional burden throughout that process. It was important to ensure sustainability of all of the various sectors within the distribution system as a result of the advice, that there really should not be any sort of negative impact, particularly from a revenue perspective, that could be impacting the some of the players within the system. The other approach is to avoid a one-size-fits-all approach to all solutions. And I think in particular, what people were concerned about is not taking a tendering approach to everything. They may be appropriate in certain situations, but that should not be considered the answer for everything. And that really, drug products today have different complexities. And as a result of that, it really, the approach should be tailored toward individual products or therapeutic classes. And then also similar to what we heard for the EML group, making sure that as this work continues, we need to build off the experiences of other individuals within the system to learn from them and take into consideration their advice. So I'm going to hand over the next part to Diane, that will talk a little bit about the work of our advisory panel.
Thanks so much, Brent. We started together as a panel made up of 9 members that come from across the various sectors that are involved in the drug ecosystem in Canada. We had people representing public drug plan perspective, private and public payers, and group beneficiary managers, hospitals, health regions, patient. We had a really strong patient caregiver representative, and people from academia, as well as both parts of the pharma sector, that being generic and brand pharmaceuticals. Everyone who's on the panel is recently employed in the sector, but not actively employed in their sectors. So they were able to bring a lot of knowledge without positional places. And I would say that the panel had incredibly open and diverse conversations, challenging questions asked of everyone, and everyone on the panel clearly learned something through the process, which was wonderful. We worked quite closely to develop our advice. The information that was done in the roundtable and the research piece that's preceded the panel was used as our starting point, and we did look to definitely build on what we already have in Canada that was working well, and focused on how could we improve that, and what implementation scenarios might exist. We came together 6 times over 8 months, including 2 in-person meetings, which were very helpful. And we had observers participate with us from the Pan-Canadian Pricing Alliance, PMPRB, and Health Canada. And we also had someone sit in from INES a couple of times. We've tried to pull up key themes that surface throughout multiple different approaches, including brainstorming, going through sequentially by part of the ecosystem, to make sure that we generated all different kinds of scenarios for discussion. We had a very good discussion of all the feedback we received during the consultation session and how the draft advice should be revised as a result. I would be remiss if I didn't say that we could not have done any of the work that we did without the incredible support of Brent Fraser and Sayako Yokoyama from CDA. They really helped us keep on track and focused as we were doing the work. So we go to the next slide. Early on, the panel grappled with the concept of what does bulk purchasing actually mean? And it became very important to the panel to be clear that the drug plans and insurance plans don't purchase drugs in the way that many people would understand it in a common sense, but we do work together, the system does work together to undertake pricing arrangements or pooled procurement, and that's a more appropriate term that we should be using as we go forward, because it more accurately reflects the complexity of the system. The second thing that really became important to the panel was that this is not just about driving for price, which people were very concerned about, that's what this would all be about. This was actually about improving access, quality, yes, getting a very competitive price, but it's not about cost at all, cost. From that perspective, we also were very agnostic as to what it actually was that was being procured, pooled procurement for. It didn't matter if the drug was for a cardiac case or for diabetes or for HIV/AIDS. The process was more what we were interested in. So if we move through to the next slide, just keeping an eye on time. The panel also had some hurdles we had to get over. One, we didn't know what the ultimate model scope design of Pharmacare in Canada was going to look like. And so we've thought it important that we look for where was the low-hanging fruit, what synergies and efficiencies could we put into the system that would help us to work more effectively together at a pan-Canadian level, and make things beneficial for the country as a whole and the citizens who live in it. The second thing was that really the full benefit of a collective effort on procurement comes when you have the whole population together, one single body. And that is not the case, nor is it going to be the case in the foreseeable future. And so there are ways that we can strengthen the scope of who is covered by a procurement, a pooled approach, even in the short term. So are there ways that we can build the size of who's covered, even without a future Pharmacare model fully in place? As I said earlier, the advice is agnostic as to what drug or product we are applying the process to. It should be generalizable to cover whatever is envisioned once implementation happens. And there were things that, because we didn't know what the ultimate design would be, needed to be sort of set aside, but provide some opportunity that should be examined in the future. For example, there are many elements of the supply chain that were beyond the scope of the panel, but where the panel believes that depending on the models chosen, there may provide opportunities for improvement and streamlining, and those should be explored and looked at over time. Go to the next slide. Quickly, if we summarize the work of the advice of the panel that we put out in our consultation document remains the same. There is a lot of change going on in the system, and there will be a lot of change going on in the system as we move to improve the way we work together. And important fundamentally to that is there needs to be a stronger collaborative environment within Canada. There needs to be a mechanism where there is ongoing engagement across the multiple sectors to look further down the line about how we can improve Canada's profile in an international global marketplace, and also oversee the changes that will happen and develop ways that we can get information that would help us continue to improve the system long term. Secondly, we need to encourage health system efficiencies and promote predictability to accelerate access. There are people living in Canada now that benefit from the negotiations that happen from within the public plans. And there are maybe opportunities, best practices that can increase the behind the scenes efficiencies. So things like enrolling other parts or inviting other parts of the system to participate in those negotiations, where they're in publicly funded plans or programs such as correctional facilities that are currently not included within provincial drug programs usually. And that can help us increase the number of people covered by the negotiation. Need to look at what's happening in group purchasing organizations that generally support the work that's done in hospitals and other community programs. They have different approaches to how they work with pharmaceutical companies, generic suppliers, and the way they manage those contracts once they have been entered into. And there's an opportunity across the country for some segments to potentially use more of that strategy in support of the negotiations that currently happen at PCPA. And then the other area we looked at was harmonization between public and private payers. There's not a lot of great data about the intersection between the public and private payer plans, but as things shift and if more products are included within the publicly funded system, there is potential for us to better understand and carve out the role for the private payer so that they could participate in it and leverage overall better value for citizens under both models. But that's complex, and it was beyond the scope of the panel to really understand all the puts and takes that go with those different handoffs or relationships and coverage patterns. And so we encourage that be something that is continually looked at, and again, harkens back to the collaborative environment. So now I'll switch over to the consultations that we did. We did our consultations in 2 phases, similarly to the EML list. We invited people to provide written feedback through a public posting of our draft advice. And the advice was organized in the 5 categories that I just went through. People had the opportunity to provide online feedback, and in particularly structured around those 5 areas, followed by general comments. And then we also did focus consultations and advisory group presentations with small discussion groups. I will say the panel found that the quality of the submissions we received and the thoughtfulness of the submissions we received in both areas was very, very helpful. In general, the feedback was very supportive of the directions that the panel had taken. But then also pointed out areas where we needed to be clearer and stronger in describing what we meant. And finally, we did have a bunch of feedback that came that was on items out of scope. And so we have incorporated those into our report as well. Next slide. We received over 45 written submissions. They came from across the whole ecosphere, from patient groups, national health charities, labor unions, consulting companies. We had from professional associations, industry, which essentially combined every part of the delivery system, pharmacy, generic companies, brand companies, healthcare providers, and found very, very helpful. We had an in-person session where we went through each and every submission that we received. We had everybody champion submissions so that we made sure the voices were heard at the table, and we went through them thematically to make sure that we captured all of the advice that we received. So next slide. What did we hear? We heard the first grouping, big thumbs up for the approach that we had taken in certain areas where there's broad agreement. So definitely everyone's supportive of the need for more collaboration amongst all the key players. the need to expand the mandate of the existing Pan-Canadian Pricing Alliance to include more procurement activities and contract management. So in the report, what we've recommended is that the PCPA develop an actual negotiating framework that has a variety of different approaches to how you would go into the discussions, depending on the nature of the product that was in place. The real expansion is in contract management, which currently is not within their mandate, but we encourage, or we're advising that it should be looked at on a voluntary basis. Some jurisdictions will not want to participate in that, but others may, and that can help us streamline timelines to list, which is a big factor in terms of helping us stay competitive in the global marketplace. Need to improve system efficiencies and enhance predictability. Again, what we heard was that Canada is a very complex environment, and if we want to get timely access to new medications as they come forward and secure supply, we need to make things more streamlined and predictable so that companies can advocate on behalf of access to Canada early to their head offices as they're doing their rollout strategies. And we need to have better coherence and integration so that we understand more about what's going on. There needs to be better data sharing and there needs to be better data collection so that we can predictably understand what is happening, both on the drugs that are listed, but also on what's coming forward so that we can think about it from a systems perspective and how it gets implemented. The second box contains areas where there was less coherence in terms of what people, like not everybody felt the same way. And there was some concerns about like, be careful about how you go along here. So aligning public and private payer negotiations. Motivators are different between the public systems and the private systems. And so we need to be thoughtful if we proceed down this path, Canada needs to be thoughtful about how it does so. It cannot afford to exclude the private payer because that has ramifications for the people who are receiving drug products through those payment mechanisms now. Similarly, you can't just wholeheartedly include them either. Need to be thoughtful about monopsony models, so where large groups are coming together and tendering, and what the unintended consequences of those models are. So there's a lot has evolved in the world in terms of procurement and tendering, lessons learned, but there are still risks that come along with that, and so you need to be quite cognizant of those. We did hear loud and clear that price transparency is a high risk endeavor. We did talk about whether or not we could provide advice that recommended that Canada move to a model where what is negotiated with companies is actually transparent to the public, which would enable a cash payer to take advantage of a lowered price. However, it is clear that is not a feasible approach, and that the panel felt there was no clear way where a cash payer could benefit from the collective work together on purchasing. There was also some conversation about how broadly could you apply GPO practices, group purchasing practices, to a public system. Group purchasing works because it's a tightly connected system, whereas the public funding systems are very removed from the providers who actually prescribe the drugs. And as a consequence, you have to be careful about which pieces of what systems you pick up on. And that there was some confusion that the panel was advocating that there's going to be new distribution models and centralized dispensing, and so we should be thinking about that. What the panel was commenting on was these things are happening in the ecosystem around the world. and we have to be cognizant of those. So as, you know, procurement moves forward, keeping an eye on the evolving landscape. And then the third box were boxes where we really needed to consider things like, how did we reflect the role of pharmacies, pharmacists, and distributors in the document and the plan going forward, the advice going forward. And so we have cleared that up and provided some more information in our report. Adding and emphasizing the role of distributors, because they're the people that actually move the product from the people who manufacture it to the people who prescribe and or dispense it, depending on the setting. We need to be clearer on our definitions and goals. And there needs to be more work done on what the actual implementation approach will be. The details of that rollout need to be more clearly spelled out before implementation begins. So the advice to the federal government is that real attention needs to be paid on the governance before implementation begins. So on the next slide, substantively, the advice of the panel remained unchanged. However, we did provide additional context around making incremental changes to the system, clarification of some of our statements under the observations and recommendations. We have provided some elaboration on the feedback that was noted that could use strengthening. And we added a new section where we had feedback that was outside the panel's work and future considerations for that government. So we just put that into a section at the end where people can, the federal government will see and be aware of the out of scope comments that we received. And essentially, what the panel's advice framework is something that's unique to our ecosystem, that it needs to be flexible and dynamic and build on the existing components that are working well and make them stronger. So with that, I will turn it back over to Dan. And I think I've shortchanged us on questions and answers, Dan.
No problem. Thanks very much, Diane and Brent. We know there's lots of interest in these projects and looking forward to this Q&A portion. Just as far as next steps coming out of today's session, we'll be preparing to deliver both final reports to the Government of Canada. So we do have time for a few questions. Just our team's in the background filtering them for me and bringing them up. So the first one is for you, Alexandra. Did the panel consider diabetes drugs, or was this out of scope because it was already listed by Health Canada?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So the answer, short and brief, is that yes, we did consider diabetes medications, for example, semaglutide, but not specific products that were already listed, for example, insulin.
Thanks. Next one's for you, Alan. What happens when HTA recommendations are split? For example, the CDA has a negative recommendation, but INES has a positive recommendation.
Yeah, that happens actually more often than you'd think. And I know that from my days when I was on CDEC. We considered the CDA recommendations to be primary. And if there was no CDA recommendation, then we moved on to an S. But CDA definitely was primary in that process.
All right. Over to you, Diane, for this next one. With the list of drugs, could this lead to call for tenders in Canada for all drugs?
So the panel recommended or is advising that the PCPA develop a negotiating, like a strategy framework that includes multiple different approaches to how you would enter into discussions depending on the product in question. One approach could be tendering for certain drugs under certain circumstances with certain components, but it was not felt to be a panacea for like all products.
Thanks. I'll stay with you and Brent for this next one. It seems the panel had looked at what is happening in some other countries. Are there any learnings from international practices that we can apply to bulk purchasing in Canada?
So every country, in all the jurisdictions we looked at, we were really hoping that there was going to be this is the way to do it. But everybody is so different. What we have seen is that there are strengths and weaknesses in the various approaches, and that we think that Canada has a unique opportunity to pick up from multiple different learnings. The single most important thing, I think, is that when you work together collaboratively as one with simple, streamlined processes, it does lead to beneficial relationships, beneficial access for patients, beneficial relationships with industry partners that can help accelerate getting the right product to the right person at the right time.
Thank you. Back over to you, Alan. How did you verify whether drugs were listed on formularies or not? For example, did you check each publicly available formulary list, for example, CAHI's formulary tool or something else?
Interesting question, and it probably speaks to a bigger question around data. But yes, we did look at every formulary. A lot of that information is publicly available in terms of what's on their formulary. And so the staff in particular that were digging into the data looked at that. The CAHI data was also used, as well as we looked at IQVIA data, which is the private payer data as well. And we tried to parse it depending on the drug, either at we looked at number of prescriptions, but also the number of recipients. Some drugs like, antibiotics, you get one prescription and you're done. Others are monthly forever. So we looked at both of those numbers. But as a bit of an anecdotal comment, as an individual citizen in this country, I'm kind of dismayed how fragmented and siloed data is in this country, and how extraordinarily difficult it was to assemble the kind of data that we needed. And I'm sure, Diane, you're probably feeling the same thing. I see you nodding your head, how difficult it is to pull together the holistic picture of what's actually being used and how it's being prescribed in this country.
There are a lot of different spreadsheets, that's for sure. Okay, so this last one's for Diane. Regarding the potential expansion of PCPA responsibilities, can you elaborate a little bit more on this? Is it a recommendation for them to buy prescription products on behalf of pharmacies?
Absolutely not. The biggest opportunity that we saw, is that PCPA could be negotiating on behalf of more entities. So that's one. So increase the pool of people covered. Currently, their mandate is restricted to the provincial and territorial public drug programs. The second area of opportunity is that they could take on some of the contract management responsibilities if a province or territory wanted them to do that. So behind the scenes, the way, in general, the way drug contracting works is you negotiate with for a new brand pharmaceutical, a single kind of a drug. You'd negotiate with a manufacturer on the recommendation that came out of CDA and what an effective price would be, which would include rebates that would come back to the jurisdiction, which would offset the cost. And it all runs through the billing system behind the scenes in a pharmacy. The management of that cycle of cash flow is significant. It is a administrative burden that in some provinces is well managed because size and scope, but in other provinces it might be an opportunity that a PCPA could take on some of that role. But that would be a big stretch, big change, would require provincial, territorial agreement, all of those things. So it would be a down the road, but we think that there's an opportunity there, and it would make things more streamlined for companies bringing products to market, which would help it improve our attractiveness as a market.
Thanks. So I think we had a thank you slide you wanted to pop back up, if you could get that. And just on behalf of both advisory panels, just a sincere big thanks to everyone who participated in our engagement. Your thoughts and perspectives have been so valuable in informing the development of both products, the proposed list and the advice on bulk purchasing. We really appreciate all of your time and contributions. I think there's one last slide that will pop up just to show the different ways that you can connect with us here at Canada's Drug Agency. Thanks very much again to our panel and to all of you for attending. Have a great day.